In the course of practice as a hospital chaplain, it's not unusual to meet patients who question whether being created by God is a gift or a curse. And this is precisely Job's quest in chapter 10, where he experiences his world being turned on its head. And so, what we're going to examine is Job's experience of distress and how his world seems to have fallen apart, and compare that to Psalm 139. Psalm 139 in part reads, speaking to God, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed." Psalm 139 might be of comfort, but it depends on how we read it. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. Or, in your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. Job chapter 10 helps us explore how all the many ways one might hear that reality of being part of God's creation. And right out of the gate in Job chapter 10, we're invited to consider who is speaking. "I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul," is how the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition renders the first verse. But there's a problem with that rendering. And the problem with that rendering is the word soul, or more precisely in the Hebrew, nephesh. Surveying the commentators, the most Jewish commentators and the most poetically and literarily inclined commentators do two things with Job chapter 10, verse 1. First, they stay away from the word soul. Nephesh is life or essence or being, not to be confused with the Greek-laden connotations of the word soul. But the other thing they do is they personify this nephesh. So instead of, "I loathe my life," the most Jewish and the most poetically and literarily inclined commentators render that, "My being itself loathes living." Something about my very essence is personified in its loathing for being forced to be alive and being forced to be part of God's creation. Now, unless this feels like word games, consider the patient lying in a hospital bed who experiences the personification of their being loathing life. To be part of God's creation is hardly a gift. Maybe it's a curse instead. This becomes especially interesting when we wonder about Psalm 139 and Job chapter 10 and which came first. Now, one of my favorite scholars, James Kugel, is quite clear that we can't know which came first. We can't know when exactly Job was written. Will Keynes wants to make the case that Job is reinterpreting Psalm 139, that the author of Job is putting a disconsolate, maybe ironic twist on a psalm that already existed. But this, again, is very interesting from the perspective of the hospital bed. Keynes points out that the resonance between Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, the text that we read at the beginning of this sermon, and Job 10, 8 through 12, that I'll read here in a moment, this resonance has been noticed from as early as the 4th century, but rarely commented on. In Job, it sounds like this: Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you turn and destroy me. Remember that you fashioned me like clay, and will you turn me to dust again? Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh. You knit me together with bones and sinews. You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. In the Hebrew, the allusion syntactically, linguistically, is unmistakable, and it can still be heard in the English through being fashioned and being knit together. But which way is the illusion working? Is it the case that the author of Job, in a place of deep darkness, is looking back at Psalm 139 and parodying it? Or, apparently equally possible, is it the case that some author of Psalm 139 is attempting to rescue Job's interpretation, Job's bitterness of being part of creation, and the author of 139 instead is looking back at Job 10 and giving it a positive spin? That second possibility is almost always what family members are doing at the bedside of a suffering loved one who is questioning the value of their creation. Interesting to consider. For Job, the physical suffering isn't even really the center of the whole thing. The center of the whole thing for Job seems to be a disoriented worldview and an emerging realization that there's a detachment of God's power and God's justice. And this comes out in verse 16 and 17 when Job echoes back to chapter 4 when Eliphaz introduced the lion, the rapacious lion from chapter 4 that gets what's coming to it. Here in chapter 10, verses 16 and 17, Job says, Bold as a lion you hunt me. You repeat your exploits against me. You renew your witness against me. God is now the attacking lion. And this upending of Eliphaz's metaphor of the lion is deeply disturbing. How can God's justice and God's power be so disconnected? And what does that mean for me? Job doesn't know. In verse 20, he says, Let me alone that I might find a little comfort. Is Job here speaking to these two friends? Is Job speaking to God? And back to the question of the patient in the hospital bed. What kind of response might we be giving to people who are suffering that could cause them to say to us, Let me alone that I may find a little comfort before I go, never to return to the land of gloom and deep darkness? Perhaps our understanding of suffering, our capacity to sit in the gloom and the deep darkness with those who suffer, and maybe our understanding of God and God's creation and God's punishment and God's justice. Perhaps all of that could use an update if we are to sit with those who suffer.